Great. Well, we're going to start right on time, and I appreciate everybody taking some time out of their day to participate in our latest education piece here from Innovation Partnerships. So we're really excited about today's speakers, and we really believe this is going to be a great opportunity to get some insight from experts in an emerging and I guess moving area with respect to FDA regulation of CDSS and AI ML-based solutions. So we're thrilled to have Pamela Forrest and Christina Kuhn with us. And of course, we're glad to have everybody join the call as well. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. There's a lot of folks on the webinar today, and that is great. We're going to try to get to everybody's questions, and we're going to try and save that to the end. So certainly feel free to chime in through the Q&A function as we go through the webinar today and submit those questions. And my colleague Tina Suntras will be facilitating that dialogue at the end, but we have so much content to get through. I'm afraid if we're jumping in and out during the discussion, it might get to be a little bit difficult. So certainly we appreciate everybody actively participating and getting those questions submitted so we can get experts to weigh in on it. With that said, Innovation Partnerships is the University of Michigan's innovation coordination engine. We work on behalf of our research community here at the University of Michigan to try and help move all the great work that's done in the research enterprise from the bench to the bedside. So helping to facilitate the ability to license that technology either to companies that are out in the marketplace or facilitate startups. One of the great opportunities certainly that we have is to create not only great minds through education and research, but certainly impact and improvement to the public good by facilitating that translational cycle. So this education series is intended to help facilitate that. We have three broad groups inside of Innovation Partnerships to assist our technology partners throughout the university. And they're as listed here, the Alliances team. And the Alliances team is specifically oriented towards facilitating and connecting U of M research expertise with the marketplace, traditionally partnerships with industry partners to address either concerns they have or to facilitate the further development and translational transition and commercialization of technologies developed here at the University of Michigan. Certainly the licensing team facilitates the contractual arrangement and intake of new inventions and content from our partners throughout the university community, and then works on behalf of our PIs to negotiate licenses and facilitate that with our partners in the commercial community. And finally, our venture group really is an engine to facilitate the startup community associated with University of Michigan IP. And we support that through a variety of mechanisms. One is through translational research funding. So that type of gap funding that moves things from an initial discovery on down the commercialization pipeline to improve its capability of success in the marketplace. We have a big group of highly sophisticated and very experienced business mentors that we facilitate that with, and then a variety of channels to connect to entrepreneurial talent as well as resources such as venture capital, and not the least of which is our incubator space, a place here in the North Campus Research Center that allows startups to have a running start, if you will, through a very modern and well-appointed facility. So our goal is very simple. It's basically to amplify the impact of the research community and have that translational effect that everyone hopes is the result of all that hard work that's gone into things that people are doing across campuses. We support every school and college, all 19 schools and colleges, and are thrilled to be your partner in making that happen. So without further ado, we'll kind of do some brief introductions and get to the real stars of the show today, Pamela and Christina. Both are from Covington and Burling LLP, and Covington and Burling, a great group that does a lot of medical device advising, as you can see from the slides here. I won't belabor the great credentials with both Pamela and Christina, but they come to this discussion with a tremendous amount of experience in all the things associated with the topic area, specifically clinical decision support and what's happening relative to the FDA. While we generally don't experience that directly as a research community, what they provide is a tremendous amount of insight into the current thinking with respect to the way the FDA is looking at these different things that we can do to improve our likelihood of success with our commercialization partner, and things we can do to prepare and be ready to help with those regulatory processes and classification and submission, just basic product development things. So we help hit the ground running. Super excited to hear about different things and perspectives they have to say today. So really happy about that. I would be remiss if I didn't thank Robin Rowe for connecting the dots here, one of our MIRs, who's done a great job in bringing this great talent to us today. So we're super excited about that. And before we turn it over to Pamela, I'll just put in a quick plug for our next seminar series. Will be the first part of April. Please look in your email for that. Very topical. We're going to be doing a discussion about intellectual property considerations associated with ChatGPT. So keep your eyes on your email, and that's something we'll be doing in April. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela. I look forward to today's presentation, and thank you so much for your time. And please submit those questions.
Thanks, Drew and Tina. We'll just get the slides put up so everyone can see them. It's really a great pleasure for me and Christina to be here with you this afternoon to talk to you about something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is how FDA regulates clinical decision support software and artificial intelligence and machine learning. So why don't we move to the next slide? And you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I just got a message that Zoom quit.
Yep, so, we can hear you. You're all good.
And I'm not ready for them to quit. So what we want to kind of focus in on are sort of two overarching questions to kind of shape our discussion today. The first is, when is digital health software regulated by FDA as a medical device? So when does that piece of software that intersects with the health world going to actually move into FDA's jurisdiction and be regulated as a medical device? So we'll talk about that in some detail. We'll talk about what a medical device is, and sort of the evolution of FDA's thinking on how to regulate digital health software. Then Christina is going to take us into a very deep dive into clinical decision support, which is really the issue of the day at FDA, but I don't want to ruin the surprise, so we'll let her take us through that. And then we'll also touch on sort of other types of digital health software besides clinical decision support software. And then in sort of part two, we want to sensitize the group to the implications from a regulatory standpoint of being regulated as a medical device. So part one is, what types of software are a medical device? And then if you trip over into that world of FDA jurisdiction, what does that world look like? What is the regulatory framework? So with that, Christina, why don't we move to the next slide, which is part one. So we'll go right to the next one. So, this is an interesting place to start. What is digital health? And, I think the answer is everything, because there's really nothing in our healthcare world that isn't digitalized anymore. So it's hard to have a precise definition of digital health. What we have here is, I think, a multitude of examples. Telemedicine, health and wellness apps, clinical decision support, remote patient monitoring software, surgical planning software, digital therapeutics, really everywhere that sort of software intersects with the healthcare world is digital health. I think we can move to the next slide. This is kind of an eyeful, but I think it's an important slide to look at because it it highlights how FDA has approached the regulation of software, and really it is an evolving process that started back in around 2013, and it's still in process. What FDA kind of did initially was issue of various guidance documents to address different types of software, mobile medical apps, wellness software, and the like. And then if I can point you to, I think, one of the more seminal dates in this evolution of FDA's thinking on the regulation of digital health would be 2016, which was a major piece of legislation called the 21st Century Cures Act, in which FDA actually changed the definition of medical device. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, to refine and then actually exclude from the definition of medical device certain types of software. So that was a really important sort of piece in this evolution of FDA's thinking. Then over time, FDA has issued additional guidance to interpret the 21st Century Cures guidance, 21st Century Cures Act. And then I would say that, until September of 2022, I think we were sort of bubbling along without any great surprises. In 2022, in the fall of 2022, FDA issued an important final guidance document on clinical decision support software, which is really the meat of our discussion today, that Christina is going to lead. So again, I won't ruin that surprise, but I think if more than anything, the issuance of that guidance document highlights that this continues to be an evolving process with I think, additional chapters to come as the story unfolds. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. And, we start almost every discussion of FDA medical device regulation, not just software, but any discussion with the definition of a medical device. And I do want the group to focus on it. It's a complicated, wordy definition, but an important one. And I always say that the most important thing of the definition of a medical device is how broad it is, how much authority FDA has to construe a product to be a medical device. So what is a medical device? It's any instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, et cetera, that is intended to diagnose disease or other conditions, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease, or affect the structure or any function of the body of man. I always point people to that last bullet point because it's so broad. A steak knife can affect the structure or function of the body of man. Now, it's not regulated as a device, but I think just, to sort of exaggerate a bit, it does show that the definition is quite broad. This third box, which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action within or on the body, and is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purpose. This piece isn't very relevant for our discussion today, but just for education purposes, the purpose of this prong is to distinguish medical devices from drugs, which in many other contexts, in terms of regulatory implications, is quite important. Not so much for today, but just so you know, that's what that prong is about. And then the most important piece of the definition for today's discussion is the except in the last box there, and that brings in the 21st Century Cures Act that I mentioned a moment ago, which took out of the definition of medical device certain software functions. So it I think tried to settle some ambiguities and grayness as to what was in and what was out in terms of software. And I think it did that in some ways, and in other ways it introduced new questions that we as lawyers now have to answer. So why don't we move to the next slide, Christina? And this slide shows the types of software at a high level that FDA excluded from the definition of medical device per the 21st Century Cures Act amendments. So what was excluded? Administrative support software, software used for billing in a medical context, for example, not something that I think we ever really thought was a medical device, but nonetheless, the law settled that that's not a medical device. General wellness software, so certain apps that may contribute to wellness without making specific disease claims. Electronic patient records, software that is purely for transferring, storing, or formatting health data, but not for analyzing health data. So those are 4 types of software that are clearly outside the definition of medical device under the 21st Century Cures Act amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The last box, again, is the story of the day, which is the clinical decision support software, which was excluded in part. It's a very complicated provision that Christine is going to talk about that took outside of the definition of medical device certain types of clinical decision support software, which was then interpreted in that important 2022 guidance that I mentioned to make things probably clearer and simultaneously more confusing. So with that, Christina, why don't you talk to us about clinical decision support software?
Thanks, Pam. And just to reiterate what Pam just said, when we talk about clinical decision support software, I think in the industry, it means a lot of different things. Generally, we're talking about software that is surfacing information that is intended to help clinicians, healthcare professionals make decisions, make diagnosis decisions, treatment decisions, follow-up care decisions about patients. And the source of that kind of support can come from a lot of different areas, machine learning and AI. It can be surfaced in different areas in terms of within a electronic health record or in a standalone software. In some cases, it's just automating kind of standard practice and protocols, and other times it may be coming up with entirely new recommendations. What we want to talk about today, I think for your purposes, is really the category of clinical decision support software that is not a device under the provision Pam just mentioned. So we're going to call that sort of non-device clinical decision support. There is certainly a category of clinical decision support that FDA does regulate as a medical device, and that's software that doesn't meet these criteria here. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking through what each of these mean, and as Pam shadowed, it is a complicated definition, but this is what's in the statute. So these are the statutory criteria you would need to meet to be clinical decision support that is not regulated as a medical device. The first goes to the kinds of inputs or data you analyze. So you cannot be intended to analyze a medical image, a signal from an in vitro diagnostic, or a pattern or signal from a signal acquisition system. And again, we'll talk about what all those words mean. Signal acquisition system was a new term that was sort of invented for this law, and FDA has interpreted. You are need to be intended for the purposes of analyzing medical information. So those two criteria kind of go together in terms of what the software can or cannot analyze and still be an unregulated clinical decision support software. The third criterion is that you need to support or provide recommendations to a healthcare professional. So this only excludes sort of clinical decision support, right, for professional use. It does not include decision support that might be for a caregiver or for a patient making a decision about their own diagnosis or care. And then the fourth is that really the sort of the crux, I think, of what FDA views as being not regulated is that the professional can independently review the basis for the recommendation that the software presents, so that it's not intended that that professional rely primarily on the recommendation when making their ultimate clinical decision. Again, we'll talk through what all of these mean because it's not really obvious necessarily from the words from the statute how FDA is interpreting them. FDA has explained how they're going to interpret those criteria, so how the agency is thinking about what it will regulate and what it will not regulate in a guidance. There have been several issued. The most recent, as Pam highlighted, was in September 2022. That's still relatively recent in sort of FDA timelines in terms of understanding how the agency is going to interpret it. That was a final version of 2 prior draft guidances. What has made it somewhat interesting is that it actually took a fairly different approach than the prior two draft guidances. Usually when FDA issues a draft and then finalizes something, the final looks kind of a lot like you would anticipate from the draft. In this case, we got a whole bunch of new information about how the agency is thinking about what is and isn't a device in terms of clinical decision support. So to walk through those criteria and make it a little bit more practical, you will be regulated if you analyze a medical image. It probably seems pretty straightforward. What's a medical image? That's anything that's actually generated by medical imaging technologies, CTs, X-rays, ultrasounds, MRIs, all medical images. Other images acquired for medical purposes, so pathology slides, dermatology images, those are medical images. Interestingly, FDA also said, even if the image wasn't originally acquired for a specific medical purpose, if you're now analyzing it for a medical purpose, it's a medical image, and your analysis of that for clinical decision support means you're going to be regulated. So functionally, what FDA said is whenever you're analyzing an image, that's going to kick you out of those criteria and FDA will regulate you. So this could include things like, a consumer takes a photo of their skin with their iPhone just because they're trying to document something. If now your software analyzes that to help, provide a diagnosis or to identify whether something's malignant or benign, the FDA is going to say that's now regulated clinical decision support. That first criterion was also that you don't analyze a pattern or signal from a signal acquisition system. And again, what does that word signal acquisition system mean? The statute, Congress kind of made it up. We have a colleague who was actually on the Hill at the time the law was passed, and we said to him, you passed this, what did it mean? He said, we don't know. So what FDA has defined it to mean is really anything that sort of analyzes physiological signals from the body. So, a classic thing would be something like an ECG, or that measures, uses photochemical kind of analysis of a specimen. So your in vitro diagnostics and other things that measure those physiological signals from the body. A pattern or a signal from those kinds of systems really is sort of repeated, multiple, sequential, or continuous measurements. So this includes a lot of things that I think folks would want to analyze for purposes of clinical decision support. So things like ECGs, continuous glucose monitors, anything that you're analyzing as a sort of a specimen like cerebrospinal fluid. FDA has said next generation sequencing data like variant call files are, a pattern or a signal. Even something as simple as like repeated hourly pulse oximetry from a bedside monitor is going to be viewed as a pattern. Sound waves or breathing patterns, pattern or signal. That means that anything that's analyzing these kinds of things to produce some sort of decision support for a clinician is going to be regulated as a medical device because it does not meet the criteria to mean it. So that's a lot of things, that people want to do as decision support that will be regulated. If, on the other hand, all you analyze is, quote, medical information, then you can qualify to be a non-regulated clinical decision support. So what's the difference between medical information and pattern or signal? FDA has said medical information is the kind of information that could be communicated between two professionals in a conversation where they understand the relevance and the relevance of that information to the decision is well understood. This can be, information from a diagnostic device if it's sort of a single discrete measurement, i.e. a single blood glucose result from a lab or a single potassium level or the like. It can also be the results of an imaging study. So you can't analyze the underlying image, but if what you have is, a pathology report or a radiologist report where they characterize what's in the image, you can analyze that in your clinical decision support. Again, the output of other, computer-assisted diagnosis or detection software can be an input into your clinical decision support, and you can remain unregulated. But that line, is a tricky line, and FDA has guidance a bunch of examples in their guidance, and it's not always clear, what's the difference between, hourly measurements from a pulse oximeter versus sort of a set of single different discrete test measurements. So that was the first two criteria. You can't, as to what inputs you can analyze and still not be regulated. The third criterion is that you have to provide recommendations to a healthcare professional. The latter part of that it has to be for a healthcare professional, I think is relatively straightforward. The part that was complicated in the most recent guidance is the concept of what constitutes a recommendation. Up until this most recent guidance, I think we all would have said, any information that you surface is a recommendation. This is not really a limiting criteria. But in the new guidance, FDA has said, no, there's only certain things that can qualify as recommendations, and it has to be plural. So what they said now and going forward is to be non-regulated, non-device clinical decision support, the kind of information, the kind of recommendations that get surfaced by your software to the professional cannot be intended to support time-critical decision-making. So, things where someone is going to take a very immediate clinical action as a result of the information you're surfacing, or you're surfacing the information in a scenario where they're making a very quick judgment, that will now be regulated. You can't be intended to replace the healthcare professional's judgment. Again, that's a bit of a wishy-washy criterion, but the sense is FDA is trying to make sure that the healthcare providers have enough time and space to really exercise their independent judgment. And then again, it has to be kind of a plural set of recommendations. So a list of preventative diagnostic or treatment options, or follow-up, or next steps. What is not a recommendation for purposes of meeting the criteria to be a non-regulated decision support software are any things that provide a specific preventative diagnostic or treatment course. So it's not a list or a specific follow-up directive. If you provide time-critical alerts or alarms, so the kinds of things like an alarm on a bedside monitor, that a patient has stopped breathing, that's not clinical, that's not non-device clinical decision support. Things again that provide a specific treatment plan or a specific diagnosis, or even information that the patient may have a specific diagnosis. FDA has now said that doesn't fall within the criteria to be unregulated, because that's not the kind of recommendations that the statute is trying to get at. Any of these kinds of things, these specific outputs, will be regulated. I will say this is an area where the guidance, FDA's interpretation, is a bit internally inconsistent, because they give examples of things that meet this criteria to be recommendations that seem like they might have a singular output. Like they have said drug-drug interaction alerts based on drug labeling can meet this criterion to be recommendations. But often that may be a singular alert, right? Like the drug you're prescribing, has a known interaction with the drug in the patient's medical record. They have also said, things like an alert of a redundant order in the medical record, right? That what you're entering is a redundant medical order can be a recommendation. But again, that's probably a singular pop-up, alert, you already have this order in the record. So it's not fully clear how this concept of a list will be applied in practice. And then the last criterion, which is that the healthcare professional must be able to independently review the basis for the recommendation that the software is providing. The way FDA has addressed this one is by outlining a whole bunch of information that the software needs to surface or make available to the professional user about how the software works, so that the professional can really understand how is the software generating that recommendation, what's the basis for that, and so the professional can decide, do I want to rely on the software or not. This is an area where FDA sort of in every guidance has said more and more information needs to be provided, and it's quite a lengthy set of information these days. I think there's a sort of practical question about whether, healthcare professionals who are busy are really going through and, looking at all this information before making a decision. But if you want to say my product is not a medical device, you need to be able to say you've done all this and meet FDA's expectations for this criterion. So the kinds of things that includes are, what are the required inputs, medical information, what data does the software analyze, how should they be obtained, what's the relevance to the analysis the software is doing, and are there data quality requirements, a description of the underlying algorithm and development and validation. So what's the summary of the logic or methods that the software uses to provide a recommendation? What are the data that were used to validate that, including like results from clinical studies that might have been used to validate it? The software itself needs to provide them with sort of patient-specific information on sort of knowns, unknowns. So if there's missing data or missing data points or other patient-specific information relevant to the specific recommendation as it gets surfaced, that needs to be flagged for the provider. And any sort of sources you're relying on, clinical practice guidelines, published literature, needs to be identified and available to the user. So not all of this needs to be kind of right at the time of the recommendation, but it needs to be somewhere in the software or labeling that the provider could review. So where does that kind of leave us if we put all those criteria together in terms of the kinds of things FDA is regulating and not regulating within this broader world of clinical decision support? The guidance has many, many examples. As I said, some of them are not totally consistent as we read them, but just as an example of some of the things, right? So analyzing a variant call file to provide treatment recommendations. So sort of matching, right, that genetic information with clinical practice guidelines or drug labeling. FDA has said that's a device because that underlying genetic sequence information doesn't meet that first criterion. Likewise, analyzing vital signs to monitor for something like a heart attack, a narcoleptic episode, or the like, regulated device. And then again, anything that's going to analyze an image, so calculating the dimensions of a lesion or identifying malignant or benign lesions from an image, regulated. What does that leave that's not a device? And again, I think in this most recent guidance, FDA has tried to pare this down to things that are frankly slightly more simple than people had hoped non-device clinical decision support could go. So this is things like, recommendations about a drug consistent with the labeling, a list of treatment options based on a diagnosis or demographics, based on guidelines, prioritized list of diagnostic tests you might do based on symptoms, and of things that really just automate really established reference information are the kinds of things FDA is listing as non-device. So that leads us to the important question today, which is how does artificial intelligence or machine learning enabled software fit within this picture? FDA, there's nothing in the guidance or those criteria that directly preclude AI or ML software from meeting those criteria. You can have an algorithm that you developed based on machine learning principles that could still meet those criteria, right? That depends on what the output is, what you're surfacing to the professionals, and whether you can meet that last criterion in terms of describing to the provider how the software is generating the recommendation. That's probably going to be more challenging for ML, machine learning developed software than in other areas, but FDA doesn't require you to describe exactly, right, what the algorithm is, but to describe the logic of the algorithm. So things like, look, we've generated an algorithm based on a patient population, and we've determined what patient factors are relevant, or we compare a patient to our data set and analyze it for relevant risk factors, might be the kind of explanation you could still give for your machine learning software. The other thing I'll flag is that a lot of what we see being developed in the sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning space for medical applications are really image related. And as I mentioned, if you're doing image analysis, you're going to be most likely in the world of medical devices. I know there's a lot more coming on, with natural language processing and the like, and that doesn't have that sort of strict cutoff the way image analysis does. And then just to wrap up, Pam talked about those 5 categories that were carved out of the statute of the definition of the device. And then we spent a while talking about clinical decision support as a category. FDA has a couple other guidances they put out that was on that timeline Pam talked about, where they said there's other things that may meet the definition of a device, but we think they're low enough risk that we're not going to regulate them nonetheless. We call that FDA's enforcement discretion. These are some examples here, things like general wellness products that relate sort of general wellness or healthy lifestyle with reducing the risk of or living well with chronic conditions. So, healthy eating to help you live well with diabetes, or encouraging exercise to help you reduce the risk of heart disease. Simple tools to track and share and trend health information, performing simple calculations, routinely used in clinical practice. Again, sort of matching patient-specific information to reference material where it meets those other criteria, and sort of general interactions with health systems, patient record systems. That was kind of a whirlwind tour of FDA's approach to clinical decision support. We are going to turn it back to Pam, just to some of the kind of, if you're in the device space, what does that mean? So even if you're early stages, you have a sense of what's coming down the pike and what you want to be getting set up for. So Pam?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And this is going to be another whirlwind tour that we often teach a 3-hour course on. So we're going to do it in about 10 minutes or so. But why don't we move to the next slide, Christina? And again, this section of our talk is meant to sensitize the group to the types of requirements that you would face if your software were regulated as a medical device. And so, kind of the most basic piece of FDA medical device regulation is the classification scheme. FDA regulates medical devices according to risk, and class 1 devices are the lowest risk. Class 2, which is where most devices fall, are considered moderate risk. And class 3 are for the highest risk devices, many of the implantables, the pacemakers, and the like. So we'll talk a little bit more about this kind of flow chart as we get into it. But the basic principle here is, the riskier that FDA perceives a device, including medical device software as a medical device, the more stringent the regulatory requirements that will apply. So let's move to the next slide. And what we've tried to do here in terms of providing an overall sense of FDA's medical device regulatory framework is to kind of talk chronologically through the life cycle of the device and the regulations that apply. So, the first step typically for an entrepreneur or even established medical device company is to innovate a device and then try to get a gauge on its safety and effectiveness, often through clinical studies, through use of the device on humans. And of course, that use would occur when the device is not yet approved. And so those devices that are not yet approved, but which the manufacturer wants to test on humans, are considered investigational devices. And FDA has a set of regulations that describe the controls that apply to devices that are being put into use on humans before they've been cleared or approved. And I think these are very important requirements to be sensitized to, to the extent that an entity is innovating a software product that then verges into the medical device world, and there's a desire to understand, if it's going to be effective. And we've seen in some client situations, often with startups and less experienced companies, that there's not necessarily a sensitivity that that's a regulated step. And indeed it is. It's the investigational device exemption piece of FDA's requirements. So you heard me just say the word exemption, and that's a clue here. FDA, again, typically for commercial use, not in clinical studies, requires devices, at least devices that are in class 2 or class 3, to be cleared or approved by FDA before they go to market. But investigational devices won't be cleared or approved because the idea is to collect data in order to inform FDA, so FDA can decide whether to clear or approve them. So FDA's investigational device exemption regulation is just that. It provides an exemption from having to be approved by FDA before the device can be used in humans. So it provides a pathway that allows for use in humans for purposes of studying the device in humans. The shorthand for that regulation is called the IDE regulation, stands for Investigational Device Exemption Regulation, and it applies to all clinical investigations of devices that are to determine the safety and effectiveness of the device. There are a few exceptions from that, which I don't think we'll talk too much about today, because I think this is more just about sensitizing the group to the notion of regulating clinical studies, but know that there are a set of exemptions, many for non-invasive diagnostic devices and some similar scenarios that FDA exempts. So let's move to the next slide, Christina. So at a high level, what are the requirements that apply to investigational devices? And again, we said that it's generally an exemption from FDA requirements. So an investigational device doesn't have to be approved before it's used in humans, provided that the sponsor of the clinical investigation complies with the requirements in FDA's investigational device exemption regulation. So what are some of those requirements? One, the device, although exempt from most of FDA's requirements that pertain to the manufacturing of the device, which are called the quality system requirements, there is a design control requirement, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, that even investigational devices have to comply with. And we see that honestly as something that is often missed for investigational devices. Another important piece of the controls that apply to investigational devices is labeling. FDA requires, I think not surprisingly, that investigational devices be labeled as for investigational use only, because again, FDA wouldn't want an investigational device to be mistaken for an approved device. It's important that an investigational device be labeled as such so that it is understood by potential users that its only lawful use is in the context of a clinical study that is subject to the stringent controls that FDA has in place. What are some other requirements that apply to investigational devices? It's not allowed for the manufacturer or anyone else to promote an investigational device as being safe and effective. Why? Because FDA hasn't reviewed data on it yet and hasn't approved it as safe and effective. So it can't be promoted as safe and effective. Why don't we move to the next slide? And just a little bit more on FDA regulation of clinical studies. FDA, again, regulates clinical studies according to risk, just as it regulates devices in general according to risk. And FDA has a certain set of requirements that apply to what it considers to be significant risk studies, which at a high level are studies involving a device that have the potential to pose a certain amount of risk to humans. Non-significant risk studies are less concerning studies. The major distinction, and it's an important one, between significant risk and non-significant risk studies is that to conduct a significant risk study, the sponsor of the study needs to submit an application to FDA called an IDE application, an investigational device exemption application, and obtain FDA's approval before beginning the study. For a non-significant risk study, there's not an FDA approval piece. IRB approval is required, as is required for significant risk, but that's really the main distinction. And then other than that, there's a number of requirements that apply, important requirements, such as obtaining informed consent from study subjects, keeping records of and reporting adverse events and the like. So, in short form, the regulation of investigational devices in clinical studies is quite stringent, and I think appropriately so, because again, this set of regulations provides a pathway for use of unapproved devices on humans, including software as a medical device that's unapproved. So if we move to the next slide, and again, this is just a little bit more on clinical studies, and we show kind of the main players in a clinical study. The sponsor, who is actually typically the manufacturer of the device, is responsible for significant risk studies, submitting the IDE application, also for obtaining IRB approval, overseeing the clinical investigators and record keeping and reporting responsibilities. The clinical investigator is actually conducting the study and is specifically responsible for obtaining informed consent, supervising the use of the device, and following the protocol, and among other things. But again, all of these requirements apply not just to our traditional medical devices, but also to software as a medical device. Just an important reiteration, because again, we often find that innovators of software devices sort of accidentally find themselves in the FDA regulated world. And this can be a surprise, not necessarily a pleasant surprise, that in fact, the research that's being conducted triggers FDA regulation. So, and then just a little bit on that design control piece that I had mentioned. FDA has a whole set of requirements that apply to the manufacturer of medical devices. For investigational devices, most of them don't apply, but the design control piece does, as it does to fully commercialized devices. And what does that mean? What does it mean to control the design of device? It almost sounds counterintuitive because we think of design as an inherently creative process. But under FDA requirements, there's a perceived need to put structure on how a device is designed to ensure that the ultimate design of the device sufficiently meets the needs of the user. And so FDA regulations impose a fairly stringent framework on controlling the design. Specific planning needs to be done for the design of a device. The inputs that are needed for the device, what's the intended use? What are the specific patient and user needs? What are the human factors? What needs to be done to ensure that the device is easily usable in a safe and effective way by the subject or the patient? And then how do we assure that those inputs have been met? What are the acceptance criteria? What do you have to look at to ensure that your device is meeting its specifications? It's a critical piece of sort of both the pre-market and the post-market world in devices, because it applies both in the clinical context and also to sort of full commercialization of devices. So then if we move to the next slide, we want to just touch on a few things that are have really come up specifically in the context of AI. And we talked about the way that FDA has been, as in an overarching manner, been grappling with and trying to get its arms around how to regulate medical device software. And there's been some specific initiatives with respect to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I think good machine learning practice is an initiative that is reflective of that. What it is really is FDA coming up with, in conjunction with international regulators, it's been sort of an exercise in harmonization, coming up with core principles to ensure that AI-driven medical devices are going to, sort of deliver the highest level of safety and effectiveness to patients. And I think it's been an important effort because, we have in the traditional device world, the set of sort of good manufacturing practices, a set of regulations that shows manufacturers what they have to do to ensure that their devices meet their specifications. This set of good machine learning practice shows FDA's thinking about what are the specific needs around AI-driven devices. And we won't go through each of these, but it's sort of core concepts like the training data set needs to be independent of the test set. The model design should be tailored to the available data and reflect the intended use of the device. Users need to be provided clear, essential information. So there's not a lot of granularity here, but in fact, it's reflective of a core set of principles that international regulators, including FDA, are sort of coming to the table on. And my guess is that in the future, we may even see specific guidance and specific regulation around this. We're not at that stage yet, but it's sort of the initial foray by the regulators to get their arms around how to ensure best practice in the AI and ML world. If we move to the next slide. So now we want to just spend really a few short minutes because we want to move to Q&A. We've talked about at a high level, what are the requirements if you want to study your device in humans? And then what are some of the specific considerations around AI? But then what's next? Let's say you finish your clinical study and you want to get to market. What are the pathways that FDA has in place to get your product to market? And so this slide, I hope, looks a little bit familiar because we had it up a few minutes ago, reminding you of the way that FDA trifurcates devices according to risk. Class 1 are the lowest risk, Class 2 are moderate risk, and Class 3 are the highest risk. And there are regulatory pathways that sort of go with each class of device. So for Class 1 devices, which are the low-risk devices, they are typically exempt from any type of pre-market review. What does that mean? It means that to get a Class 1 device to market in general, a company does not need to submit an application to FDA, but rather can go to market without FDA giving a yes or no. That doesn't mean there's no regulation. There's a lot of post-market regulation around device quality, around adverse event reporting, around labeling and the like, but nothing on the pre-market side in general for Class 1. Class 2 devices, which are moderate risk devices, are subject to, in general, a pre-market review step, which is called the 510K in general, and we'll talk about that. And then the Class 3 devices, which are the riskiest devices, are subject to the most stringent type of pathway to market, which is called a pre-market approval application, or PMA. And it's about as close to drug regulation as device regulation gets. It's a lengthy application process over multiple years that typically requires some significant clinical data. So if we jump in a little bit, Christina, just a few words on the 510K, which again is that application that is the most prevalent application for medical devices because it attaches to most of the Class 2 medical devices, the moderate risk devices. And what is a 510K? If you have finished your clinical study, if you need a clinical study, and you don't always need a clinical study for 510Ks, often you don't, but you've got your data ready, you want to go to FDA and you're going to submit your 510K. What are you showing FDA in a 510K? It's actually an interesting application. It's a comparative application. A 510K is a demonstration of something called substantial equivalence. You're showing to FDA that you're as safe and effective as a legally marketed device. So you're not providing a sort of a threshold demonstration of safety and effectiveness, but rather you're comparing your device to a device that's already legally on the market that FDA has blessed. And what does that mean? It means you need to show FDA that your device has the same intended use as that comparator, which is called the predicate device, and it has the same technological characteristics, or it's different. But those different technological characteristics don't create new issues of safety and effectiveness. Now, that is a 2-minute summary of 510Ks, which again could be many hours, but I think it's a critically important piece for software innovators to understand, because to the extent that you verge into the jurisdiction of FDA medical device regulation, there's a high likelihood that this is the type of application that you would need to submit. And if we move to the next slide, Christina. So what's different, or what are some of the challenges that arise in the context of AI-driven software devices as opposed to traditional devices. And I think this is a really important piece. It's the sort of beauty or specialness of AI that creates the most confusing pieces for FDA medical device regulation. What do I mean by that? As we know, AI is all about learning, about training a product to do better the next time, which has a lot of sort of powerful import in the medical device world, but creates a challenge for FDA because FDA is used to clearing or approving a medical device that stays the same until the manufacturer decides to change it. Whereas in the AI world, the device, if it's operating using AI in real time, is going to keep getting better. That's the theory behind AI. And so where does that leave FDA? How does FDA approve a device that might be different tomorrow than it is today? So FDA, again, just like the good machine learning practices, has been grappling with this challenge and has come up with something that's called a predetermined change control plan, which has been used in a few applications by innovators of AI-driven software devices. And what it does is it requires the sponsor of the application to anticipate the types of changes that could occur with its device, and then provide FDA with a plan or a set of controls that the manufacturer has for managing those changes, for ensuring that those changes will not significantly disrupt the safety or effectiveness of the device. I think it's been a quite innovative sort of construct on the part of FDA. We've seen it now play out in a few applications. And I think the good news is that in very recent legislation at the end of last year, we saw the notion of the predetermined change control plan be put into law. So whereas previously it was in guidance by FDA, it's now been essentially blessed by Congress as a potential tool for not only innovators of AI-driven software devices, but for traditional devices as well. It's much too early to know how this will play out. But I think it's again, an important beacon of what's to come, and will likely open the door to sort of more applications for evolving devices that are driven by AI. And I think we should go quickly, just very briefly. There's another type of application which we often see actually in the software world, which is called a de novo classification, which is for those moderate risk and low risk devices for which you can't do a 510K. If you recall, a 510K is a comparative application where you're showing FDA that you're as safe and effective as a legally marketed device. Well, where does that put a company who has a novel device, which is more and more the case in the world of software and AI? It creates a bit of a void. You're not high risk, so you're not going to do a PMA, but you can't find a device to compare it to because you have a novel device. Well, luckily, through amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act from several years ago now, we have a middle path that's called a de novo classification, which is just for those types of products that are novel, that are low or moderate risk, where you can't find anything to compare them to. And we see, Christine and I, in our practice, this pathway being used more and more, particularly in the world of software, AI, and ML. And then we can move to the next slide. And I won't say much about PMA, except that it's the hardest application that we try to avoid if possible, but sometimes we can't. And maybe, Christina, you can just wrap up in a few moments so we can open up to Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. We just wanted a few final notes on kind of what you'd be looking for on the pathway. I mean, one thing we hear a lot is, okay, I read the guidances or I talked to my advisors and I still don't know whether my product's a device or what the classification would be. You know, can I get feedback from FDA? So there's a couple different mechanisms. The FDA digital health team actually has an email inbox. They encourage sponsors to reach out to them for sort of informal questions about the guidance, about how it might apply to you, how to engage with FDA. That's entirely informal. There's no kind of rules on how FDA will engage with you. So sometimes they're quick, sometimes they take a long time, but it can be a helpful first step. There is a formal process under Section 513G of the statute to formally request a designation of whether your product is a device or not, and if it's a device, how it will be regulated. That's a tool folks like to use sometimes if they think they're not a device and they want a formal sort of FDA blessing of that pathway. Maybe investors want that before they move forward. And then the third option is called a pre-submission program. That's really more for engaging with FDA. When you think you're a device and you want more discussion with the agency about like what kind of clinical data, if any, do I need, or can I do the 510K pathway, or do I need to do a de novo pathway Pam mentioned? That's an opportunity to kind of submit a package, and then FDA will give you written feedback and you have the opportunity for a meeting. We also just very briefly wanted to mention the pre-cert program, which you may have heard of. It garnered a lot of enthusiasm and interest when FDA first announced it 5 or 6 years ago now. The idea was this was going to be like TSA pre-check. Instead of looking at everything, device, they would look at the sponsor or the manufacturer. And if you could qualify as sort of a quality manufacturer, then your individual products would get streamlined review because FDA would have confidence that you're using appropriate sort of mechanisms for software development. And that went through a long phase of kind of piloting and working models and test plans. But relatively recently, the second half of last year, FDA put out kind of their final report. And the ultimate outcome of that is FDA said, well, it's, we think it's a great place to go to, but we had some challenges. Ultimately, we're trying to work within our existing regimes that Pam mentioned, and we don't really have a statutory authority to implement this kind of streamlined review that we want. So that for now is kind of not moving forward. We'll see, I guess, if Congress gives FDA the authority they think they need to really move it forward. But just wanted to let you know its status since a lot of folks have heard about it. And the very last thing to mention in like a minute is just, you do all that, you get to market, what, if you're taking this forward yourself, what happens then? A bunch of requirements that apply once you're on the market in terms of ongoing monitoring, that quality system and design controls Pam mentioned apply, but that also includes things like evaluating complaints that you receive, reporting any of those that might relate to serious injuries or malfunctions of your software that could lead to a death or serious injury. Evaluating whether you need to initiate an update or a recall or some other action with software in the field, and some of those will be reportable to FDA, complying with labeling and also limitations on how you promote your product. And then just sort of FDA generally has authority under the adulteration and misbranding provisions to enforce all of those requirements above. So I know we got some great questions in the Q&A, but maybe Tina, you can kick us off.
Sure. I just want to thank you both again for coming to speak to our group. I think this has been a fantastic session, and I know I myself learned a whole lot of information, so thank you so much. And just as a reminder to everyone in the call right now, we're having our next session in April on ChatGPT, so please keep your eye out on your emails for that. The recording from this session we'll post on YouTube afterwards, and we'll email it out to everybody. So just hopefully those kind of answer some housekeeping questions. I'm just going to go through the Q&A in order, and I'll just read out the question, then Christina and Pam, you can just jump in and answer it. So the first one says, what's the definition of immediate? If you send an alert to a provider about an impending deterioration that they'd potentially react to within 1 to 2 hour time frame after consulting with the rest of the care team, does that fall under immediate definition?
Yeah, Pam, I'll take this, if that's okay.
Sure.
FDA doesn't define a specific time frame in terms of what's, a time critical recommendation that would be regulated or what's not. The kinds of examples they give where they say that is a time critical are things like that software I mentioned where you're monitoring for, a heart attack or for a narcolepsy episode, things where you're monitoring really for life-threatening situations, or things where you need to take a time-sensitive intervention. So, it's hard, I think, to say whether is an hour long enough or not. I think it's more about the nature of the decision they're making in that time frame. So, if it's to prescribe a cholesterol medication, that's not usually time sensitive, right? If it's an hour later, but they're, it's still within kind of decision making about treating a stroke patient, that's sort of everything in that time frame is going to be a time critical, even if you have a delay in when they look at it.
Awesome, thanks. So the next one kind of has a preamble and then the question at the end. It says, this guidance sure does seem like a big departure from prior views and quite controversial. How well it aligns with the 21st Century Cures Act on CDS definition. And I know there's some industry pushback, but it's a final guidance. Do you see this as still evolving, or is this what we've got for the foreseeable future?
And I can put a thought on that. It's we don't know, obviously, and it has sent a lot of reverberations through industry and was unexpected. We didn't expect what seems to be a significant narrowing of what is considered non-device clinical decision support software. And it's not clear to us that FDA anticipated that there would be this sort of surprise and upset among companies. We have seen, there have been other instances in sort of the history of FDA guidance and regulation where guidance was issued and it garnered a response that perhaps wasn't anticipated by FDA, where FDA has, sort of reopened the guidance for comment or issued a revised guidance. So there's no indication at all that will happen here, but I want to point out that there is precedent for that sort of thing happening. I think it's just really too early to tell. We've not seen much enforcement in this area at all, so it's hard to know what's driving decisions. But I think we'll see more guidance. Whether we see different guidance, I mean, it's just me talking, that there's enough, I think, enough questions raised and interest garnered here that I would expect over time we'll hear more. And Christina, anything else you'd add to that?
No, I agree with that. I mean,
Yeah.
especially in the software space, that timeline Pam had up, a lot of those were FDA revising its own final guidances. So I don't think the fact that it's final precludes FDA from issuing a new final guidance. But I think, as Pam said, the question is, if we get a new final guidance, will it change FDA's views? Because I think FDA was surprised by industry surprise. So
awesome, thanks. I also really like that graphic too that you had on that slide. So the next question is, can you please comment more on singular versus plural recommendations? Sounds like an arbitrary criteria.
You can take that, Christina.
Yeah, I don't disagree that it's a bit arbitrary. I think that is the hardest area of questions that came out of the new guidance, or the hardest area of interpretation. Unfortunately, the guidance doesn't tell us much more than what we talked about. There are, many examples, pages and pages of examples that may be worth perusing in the guidance if you would like to try to parse what FDA is doing on their side. But, there's just some inconsistencies, and it is not really clear why FDA is drawing some of those lines.
Okay, so the next question says, do you see something like CBT software falling into more of the unregulated wellness space? So CBT, I'm assuming, is cognitive behavioral therapy.
So the FDA has actually approved or cleared, mostly through the de novo process, several CBT-based therapeutic devices. So like CBT for pain, CBT for opioid abuse disorders, and the like. So I think FDA generally views CBT, if it has a therapeutic indication, right, that you're trying to treat a disease or condition with, that's going to be a medical device. There may be elements of CBT, of mindfulness and the like, if you're sort of applying them to sort of everyday life, or general levels of stress that you might be able to say was wellness.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is, do these criteria only apply when the use of AI/ML model is for profit? If somebody publishes a risk score that technically falls under the medical device definition and a provider/unit/institution decides to use it for their patients, do FDA regulations apply?
I mean, technically FDA regulations apply when you put a medical device into interstate commerce and make it available for use. So I think those are some tricky questions that arise, and it's often unclear, I think, to the entity that's sort of putting it out there that there can be implications, but there's nothing to say that it wouldn't trigger regulation.
Yeah. Can I just add, I think,
Yeah.
you're talking about like publishing a journal article where you describe a model.
Well, no, then, right, that would not be.
Yeah,
No.
a publication of an article.
Publication is not, talking about it isn't.
Okay. So the next question is, are AI/ML applications all that different? In any device with analysis of data, the developers have used real-life data, developed a model, and validated it for effectiveness. Does the effectiveness and usefulness of the device really change depending on how they develop the model?
No, I mean, I think the tricky part with AI is not using it to develop the device. It's where it's running the device sort of going forward. And that goes to the point I was making, where you have a device that isn't static, that's changing and getting better. But I don't think there are necessarily unique challenges that arise because AI was used to develop a device. Do you agree, Christina?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Tina, I see the next question too, which relates to this, but no, I mean, FDA doesn't have, other than what Pam just mentioned with the sort of post-market changes, there's no separate framework for AI.
No.
So the same considerations apply. Things like, is there bias in my data set may become more important for machine learning developed models than, a clinical trial of a diagnostic device, but there's not like a separate set of principles or considerations really.
So I guess the next question, we can kind of go a little quick. It just says, what happens if you don't adhere to the GLMP? What are the implications?
Yeah, those are the good machine learning practices. Yeah, I mean, those are not regulations. So there's not a specific legal consequence, although I think that those concepts could easily and probably are reflected in the back and forth between FDA and an applicant on an AI-driven device. So I think there could be obstacles in terms of getting to market for failure to comply with those, but they don't right now link to a specific regulation. Does that make sense?
Yep. So I just want to do a time check because I see it's 5:12 and we had said we were going to end at 5:15. We have 9 questions. How do you guys feel about continuing to work through some?
I'm okay to stay for a few more minutes. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So the next question says, what does the 510 clearance mean for class 2?
So again, class 2 is the middle category of devices. It's moderate risk devices, class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 2 devices are typically subject to what's called the 510K requirement for pre-market review. That just refers to the section of the statute of the law. That's what 510K means. So the concept of a 510K is, as I mentioned, to demonstrate substantial equivalence. So if you're going to do a 510K for a device, be it a class 2 or a class 1 device, because some class 1 devices are subject to 510K, the activity is the same in concept, which is you have to identify a predicate device, a comparator device, and demonstrate to FDA that your device has the same intended use as the predicate device and the same technological characteristics, or if the technological characteristics differ, that there aren't new issues of safety and effectiveness. So it's not the exercise of being successful with a 510K is agnostic to whether it's a class 1 or class 2 device. It's the notion of demonstrating substantial equivalence.
Thanks.
Mhm.
So the next question says, Epic has multiple AI ML models that don't have FDA approval, but they seem to be regulated based on your presentation. They were deployed before the latest FDA guidance. Those models are still being used. How does the new guidance impact the models that are already in use?
So I think we're not going to actually address questions that are specific for companies or specific devices.
Yeah, I can just, the question generally about how, what happens to software that was on the market before the guidance, if the guidance seems to have changed things. I think, again, FDA, when this was raised, seemed sort of surprised. They think their guidance is not that consistent, but they essentially encourage folks to come talk to them if you think you've been impacted by the guidance. And our sense is the agency is trying to work with folks, to sort of for an appropriate pathway for those products.
I'm gonna just maybe as one of our almost last questions, jump to one that's kind of at the bottom of the list, but I think it might apply to a lot of people in our audience. What's your advice for inventors and entrepreneurs that find it unclear whether the product they're developing will or will not be regulated?
Great question. There's a lot of different ways to tackle that. I mean, you can certainly engage with an expert in the field, a consultant or a lawyer like me, Christina, and get advice based on the experience of the lawyer or consultant as to whether the product will fall within FDA's jurisdiction, and get a sense also of sort of how gray the area is. Is it clear that it's not regulated, or is it clear it is regulated, or is it in a vast gray space? And then it really comes down to sort of how much certainty do you want? Christina mentioned at the end of the presentation, there are some mechanisms available to get certainty from FDA. There's the 513G mechanism, which allows an entity to request from FDA to weigh in on the regulatory status of a product. So, and there are many companies that do that. And then there are companies that do their own analysis and reach a conclusion that they feel that they can stand by, and they don't interact. And then there's also, as Christina mentioned, the pre-submission process where you can meet with FDA and ask questions and gain some feedback from FDA as to where you stand regulatorily. So there are mechanisms. It's a question of really sort of how much certainty you're looking for.
Awesome. I think that that's really helpful, and hopefully this webinar outlines some of those resources for people. If you guys are okay, we'll just have just a few more.
Sure.
So this one says, my question assumes locked models. If your device is learning and changing on the fly, then that is completely different and needs special regulations.
Yes, I think we touched on that. This goes with the question about how different are AI and machine learning. So I think we touched on that earlier.
Awesome. So the next one says, can you touch on design inputs / design outputs and verification testing for software regulated as a medical device? Then they asked another question below that said, can you also touch on risk management plans required under design controls? So we can kind of loop those together if possible.
You want
Yeah, so what the design control requirements really requires you to have procedures and a structured process for things. I mean, design inputs are your user needs. So what's driving your design of your device? What's the sort of user need that you're meeting? And that can be defined in a number of different ways, from market research, from other testing. And then your outputs are really going to be your specifications. What is it that your device needs to do? So your software specifications and other elements. And again, there's, I think those are fairly standard documents. Risk management, what FDA is going to want to see, and Pam, maybe you'll speak this too, is really sort of a risk hazard analysis where you identify all the possible risks that could arise from your device, right? All the way things could go wrong and that could lead to risk. And sort of what's the hazard associated with that? What's the risk level presented by each of those things? Do you have appropriate mitigations in place for them? And have they been mitigated, to a reasonable level or as far as reasonably possible? And then that's an iterative process. So, as you go through, you may identify new risks, or you may realize the level of risk presented changes, and then you need to update that risk management analysis, the risk analysis, and implement new risk management functionalities as needed. Pam, I don't know if you have anything more to add on that.
No, I think that's good.
Awesome. Okay, well, I just want to be mindful of time because I know that we're kind of a little bit over time as well. I just want to thank everyone for submitting their questions. And again, thank you to both of our speakers for your time and kind of sharing your expertise with our group. We're really grateful for you guys kind of coming to speak today. For everyone, again, just a final reminder that our next software thought leadership series will be in April on ChatGPT. And this recording will be posted. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today.